September 5, 1935. Kingsbury Run, Cleveland, Ohio. Two young boys, playing in the tall grass along a desolate stretch of railroad tracks, stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What they had found wasn't a discarded mannequin or a movie prop, as they first hoped. It was the headless, castrated torso of a man, his body severed with surgical precision. This discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most terrifying and unsolved serial killer cases in American history, a reign of terror that would claim at least 12 lives, stump the legendary Eliot Ness, and reveal how even America's most famous lawman could be brought to his knees by pure, calculated evil. For 3 years, a killer stalked Cleveland's forgotten souls, the homeless, the desperate, the invisible people society had abandoned. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run didn't just murder his victims. He dismembered them with the skill of a surgeon and the sadism of a monster, leaving behind a trail of severed body parts that would traumatize investigators and terrorize an entire city. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city on its knees. The Great Depression had transformed the industrial powerhouse into a landscape of broken dreams and desperate people. Nowhere was this more evident than in the area known as Kingsbury Run, a narrow creek bed that wound through the city's east side like an open wound. Most victims came from an area east of Kingsbury Run called the Roaring Third, or Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling dens, brothels, and vagrants. This was Cleveland's shadow world, populated by people who had fallen through society's cracks, unemployed workers, transients, prostitutes, and anyone else who had nowhere left to go. It was the perfect hunting ground for a killer who understood that some victims would never be missed. The discovery of that first torso in September 1935 should have sent shockwaves through Cleveland's police department. Instead, it was treated as an isolated incident, possibly a gangland killing or a botched robbery. The victim was a white male, approximately 40 years old, but his head and hands had been expertly removed, making identification impossible. He too had been murdered by decapitation, a very unusual way of killing someone. There were rope burns on each wrist, raising the specter of a man emasculated and decapitated while fully conscious, hands tied behind him. But this was just the beginning. The killer who would become known as the Mad Butcher was methodical, patient, and just getting started. 3 weeks later, on September 23rd, another body was discovered just 30 feet from where the first torso had been found. This time it was a complete corpse, a middle-aged man who had been decapitated and emasculated with the same surgical precision. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't random violence. This was the work of someone who took pleasure in the systematic destruction of human bodies. The killer's signature was emerging with terrifying clarity. Each victim was decapitated. Most were dismembered with surgical skill. Many showed evidence of being emasculated while still alive. The level of anatomical knowledge required suggested someone with medical training, a doctor, surgeon, or mortician who had turned their healing knowledge into an instrument of unimaginable torture. As autumn turned to winter in 1935, Cleveland police realized they weren't dealing with isolated murders. They were facing a serial killer with the knowledge to dismember bodies like a professional butcher and the sadism to torture victims before killing them. The investigation that followed would reveal the inadequacies of Depression-era law enforcement and set the stage for one of the most intensive manhunts in American criminal history. The killings continued with methodical regularity throughout 1936 and 1937. Between 1934 and 1938 in Cleveland, Ohio, near Kingsbury Run, 13 people, comprised of 6 women and 7 men, were killed by a serial killer. Of those 13, only 3 were identified. And almost all of them were vagrants or sex workers. Each discovery was more horrific than the last. Bodies were found in various stages of dismemberment, some missing only heads and hands, others cut into dozens of pieces with surgical precision. The killer wasn't just murdering people, he was conducting elaborate dissections that spoke of both medical knowledge and psychological sadism. The most chilling aspect of the murders was the evidence that many victims had been killed slowly, methodically, while fully conscious. Rope burns on wrists and ankles suggested they had been restrained during their ordeal. The torso murderer killed 7 men and 5 or 6 women. He dismembered most of his victims, cutting them apart with a skill that suggested a knowledge of human anatomy. He was also known as the headhunter because he always cut off the victims' heads, and as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury. The killer's choice of victims revealed a calculated strategy. By targeting society's most vulnerable and forgotten people, homeless transients, prostitutes, alcoholics, the butcher ensured that his crimes would go unnoticed for extended periods. Many victims weren't reported missing for weeks or months, giving the killer time to dispose of body parts and cover his tracks. But the geographic pattern of the discoveries told a different story. The killer wasn't randomly dumping bodies throughout Cleveland. He was specifically using Kingsbury Run as his disposal site, suggesting either a deep knowledge of the area or a psychological connection to the location. Investigators began to theorize that the killer had a base of operations near Kingsbury Run, somewhere he could hold victims for extended periods while conducting his gruesome experiments. The level of dismemberment suggested access to specialized tools and a private location where screams wouldn't be heard. The psychological profile that emerged was terrifying in its implications. This wasn't a disorganized killer striking in moments of rage or desperation. This was someone who planned each murder with the precision of a military operation, selected victims with careful calculation, and took pleasure in the systematic destruction of human life. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the killer was becoming more confident, more brazen, and more sadistic with each murder. Early victims had been killed and dismembered post-mortem. Later victims showed evidence of being tortured and dismembered while still alive. The Mad Butcher was evolving, and Cleveland police were no closer to catching him than they had been after the first discovery in September 1935. By 1936, the Cleveland torso murders had become a national embarrassment. A serial killer was operating with impunity in one of America's major cities, leaving dismembered bodies like calling cards while police remained baffled and helpless. Cleveland's mayor, Harold Burton, needed someone who could restore public confidence and bring the killer to justice. He turned to the most famous lawman in America, Eliot Ness, the legendary agent who had supposedly brought down Al Capone and his bootlegging empire in Chicago. In 1936, while the case was still fresh and bodies were still being discovered, Safety Director Eliot Ness became heavily involved. Ness arrived in Cleveland with a reputation for incorruptible law enforcement and innovative investigative techniques. The public expected him to solve the torso murders with the same efficiency he had supposedly displayed against organized crime in Chicago. Instead, he would discover that catching a serial killer required very different skills than pursuing bootleggers. The reality was that Ness's role in bringing down Al Capone had been vastly exaggerated by Hollywood and popular culture. Ness hogged a disproportionate share of the credit for collaring Capone, and behind the scenes he was a crude fill, and the Cleveland torso murders would expose the gap between Ness's manufactured legend and his actual investigative abilities. From the beginning, Ness approached the case with the same tactics that had worked against organized crime: raids, surveillance, and the application of overwhelming force. But the Mad Butcher wasn't a bootlegger with a fixed base of operations and a network of associates. He was a lone predator who moved through Cleveland's shadows like a ghost. Ness's first major initiative was to flood Kingsbury Run with police officers, hoping to catch the killer in the act of disposing of another body. The result was predictable. The killer simply changed his methods, continuing to murder victims but disposing of them in different locations around Cleveland. When that failed, Ness turned to more controversial tactics. He ordered mass arrests of anyone found in the Kingsbury Run area, believing that the killer might be hiding among Cleveland's transient population. Hundreds of homeless people were rounded up, fingerprinted, and interrogated without producing any meaningful leads. The investigation was consuming enormous resources while producing minimal results. Bodies continued to appear throughout 1937, each discovery serving as evidence that Ness was no closer to solving the case than his predecessors had been. But behind the scenes, Ness was developing a theory about the killer's identity, a theory that would lead to one of the most controversial decisions of his career and reveal the political complexities that could derail even the most determined investigation. By early 1938, Eliot Ness had become convinced he knew the identity of the Cleveland torso murderer. Ness contributed to the arrest and interrogation of one of the prime suspects, Dr. Francis Sweeney, and personally conducted raids into shantytowns and eventually burned them down. Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney was a 44-year-old surgeon who fit the psychological and technical profile of the killer perfectly. He was a doctor and would have had the necessary skill and anatomical knowledge to perform the killings. Sweeney had also been probate court multiple times, and his wife noted his problems with alcoholism, his abuse of her and their 2 sons, his days long disappearing. Sweeney's background was both impressive and deeply troubling. He had served as a medical officer during World War I, where he had conducted numerous battlefield amputations under extreme conditions. During his time in the war, he conducted amputations of wounded soldiers. He later developed mental illness. Police brought him in, and the doctor failed a lie detector test. But what made Sweeney particularly compelling as a suspect wasn't just his medical knowledge. It was his psychological deterioration and connection to the Kingsbury Run area. Due to a lack of understanding around psychological issues like PTSD at the time, Sweeney's mental health allegedly deteriorated over time despite being a brilliant doctor and surgeon. Twice, his wife appeared in probate court to have Francis committed to a psychiatric institution before she finally filed for divorce in 1934. She told them he neglected his medical practice, drank excessively, and disappeared for days at a time. The timeline was damning. Sweeney's mental breakdown and his wife's divorce proceedings coincided almost exactly with the beginning of the torso murders. His unexplained absences corresponded with the discovery of new victims. His medical skills matched the surgical precision displayed in the dismemberments. When Ness brought Sweeney in for questioning, the interrogation revealed a man on the edge of complete psychological collapse. Sweeney was drunk, belligerent, and showed signs of the kind of dissociation that investigators had theorized might characterize the killer. Most damaging was Sweeney's performance on a polygraph examination administered by one of the most respected lie detector operators in the country. The results suggested deception on every key question related to the murders, providing Ness with what he believed was confirmation of Sweeney's guilt. But as Ness prepared to build a case against his prime suspect, he discovered that catching the killer was only half the battle. The other half involved navigating the political realities that could make prosecution impossible, regardless of the strength of the evidence. In an ironic and unfortunate twist for the investigators, Sweeney's cousin was a Democratic congressman in Ohio named Martin Sweeney. Congressman Sweeney had been relentless. Dr. Francis Sweeney wasn't just a mentally ill surgeon with a history of violence. He was the cousin of Congressman Martin Sweeney, one of Ohio's most powerful Democratic politicians and a vocal critic of the Republican administration that had appointed Eliot Ness. The discovery of Dr. Francis Sweeney's political connections created an impossible situation for Eliot Ness. He was convinced he had identified the Cleveland torso murderer, but pursuing the case against Sweeney would require confronting one of Ohio's most powerful political families. Unfortunately, Francis Sweeney was related to the U.S. Representative, Martin Sweeney, which complicated matters for Ness. The suspect voluntarily committed himself to a mental institution, which placed him out of legal reach of Ness and his team. Had Ness pursued the doctor further, the doctor had an insanity defense virtually locked. The political implications extended far beyond just family loyalty. Congressman Martin Sweeney was a vocal opponent of the Republican mayor who had appointed Ness, and any high-profile arrest of his cousin would inevitably become a partisan political battle that could destroy careers and derail the investigation. But before Ness could decide how to proceed, Dr. Francis Sweeney made the decision for him. Recognizing that he was under intense scrutiny and possibly aware that his psychological state was deteriorating beyond his ability to control, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home, a veterans' psychiatric facility. The timing of Sweeney's self-commitment was particularly significant. He entered the facility just days before Ness was planning to arrest him, suggesting either guilty knowledge or advice from someone who understood the legal implications of his situation. From a legal standpoint, Sweeney's institutionalization was devastating to any potential prosecution. Even if Ness could prove his involvement in the murders, Sweeney's documented mental illness and voluntary commitment would provide the foundation for an insanity defense that would be virtually impossible to overcome. Faced with this reality, Ness made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rather than pursue a case he couldn't win against a politically connected suspect, he chose to end the investigation through more dramatic means. Safety Director Eliot Ness immediately ordered the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run burned to the ground, which ended the torso murders. On August 18, 1938, Ness orchestrated one of the most controversial law enforcement operations in Cleveland's history. Without warning or legal authority, he ordered police to raid every shantytown and homeless camp in the Kingsbury Run area, arresting hundreds of transients and burning their makeshift shelters to the ground. The official justification was that destroying the camps would eliminate potential victims and force the killer to find new hunting grounds where he might be more easily detected. The real purpose was to create the appearance of decisive action while concealing the fact that the investigation had reached a political dead end. The raids were brutal and indiscriminate. Homeless people who had committed no crimes other than poverty were arrested, fingerprinted, and held without charges. Personal belongings accumulated over months or years were destroyed in the fires that consumed the camps. Families were separated, and people who had found small measures of stability in the camps were scattered across Cleveland. From a public relations standpoint, the operation was initially successful. The dramatic images of burning shantytowns and mass arrests created the impression that Ness was taking decisive action against the torso murderer. Media coverage focused on the scale of the operation rather than its legal or humanitarian implications. But the true test of Ness's strategy would be whether it actually stopped the murders. If the killer was indeed among the people who had been displaced from Kingsbury Run, then the raids might have achieved their intended purpose. If not, they would be exposed as nothing more than political theater designed to mask investigative failure. 4 days after the burning, on August 22, 1938, Ness launched an equally draconian operation where he personally dispatched 6 two-man search teams on a large area of Cleveland. The massive sweeps and burning of the shantytowns had an immediate and dramatic effect. The Cleveland torso murders stopped. No new dismembered bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run. No more victims were found with the surgical precision and sadistic mutilation that had characterized the Mad Butcher's work. On the surface, it appeared that Eliot Ness had succeeded where others had failed. The raids and destruction of the camps had apparently eliminated the killer's hunting grounds and forced him to cease his operations. Cleveland's newspapers praised Ness for his decisive action, and his reputation as America's premier lawman seemed restored. But the reality was more complex and troubling. The murders had stopped not because the killer had been caught, but because he had been driven underground or out of Cleveland entirely. Dr. Francis Sweeney remained institutionalized, safely removed from society but never prosecuted for the crimes Ness believed he had committed. Ness determined that a politically well-connected alcoholic surgeon was the killer and got him off the street but not into court. The lack of formal resolution left haunting questions that would never be answered. Had Sweeney actually been the Mad Butcher, or had Ness's investigation focused on the wrong suspect while the real killer escaped justice? Were the political connections that protected Sweeney from prosecution evidence of corruption, or were they simply the unfortunate reality of a case that couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt? Most troubling was the realization that the investigation had been abandoned not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the political costs of pursuing it were too high. The Cleveland torso murders had revealed the limitations of American law enforcement when confronted with crimes that crossed social and political boundaries. For Eliot Ness, the case marked the beginning of the end of his legendary career. The gap between his manufactured reputation and his actual abilities had been exposed by a killer who understood that some crimes were too complex for traditional law enforcement methods. Either way, his presence and his connection to Francis Sweeney was enough that Eliot Ness never charged Francis Sweeney, despite apparently going to his grave believing that Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney was the Cleveland torso murderer. Ness would carry the burden of this unresolved case for the rest of his life, convinced he had identified the killer but unable to prove it in court. The legend of Eliot Ness had been built on the fiction that good always triumphed over evil, that determination and integrity were sufficient to ensure justice. The Cleveland torso murders had proven that sometimes evil was too well connected to prosecute, too intelligent to catch, and too careful to leave the kind of evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. Dr. Francis Sweeney remained institutionalized for the rest of his life, dying in 1964 without ever being formally charged with the Cleveland torso murders. After 80 years after Frank Dolezal was murdered in his prison cell as the suspected serial killer, multiple investigators have uncovered both old and new evidence that most certainly points to Dr. Francis Sweeney as the most likely perpetrator of the crimes. The evidence against Sweeney was circumstantial but compelling. His medical knowledge matched the surgical precision of the dismemberments. His psychological deterioration coincided with the timeline of the murders. His geographic connection to Cleveland's east side placed him in the right location to commit the crimes. Most significantly, his voluntary commitment to a psychiatric institution occurred just as Ness was preparing to arrest him, and the murders stopped immediately after he was removed from society. While this could be coincidence, the timing suggests either guilty knowledge or extraordinary bad luck. But questions remain that will never be answered definitively. Did Sweeney actually commit the murders? Or was he simply a convenient suspect whose mental illness and political connections made him an attractive target for an investigation that was under intense public pressure to produce results? The possibility exists that the real Mad Butcher was never identified, never caught, and never punished for crimes that terrorized Cleveland for 3 years. The killer could have been any of dozens of other suspects who were investigated and dismissed, or someone who was never considered by police at all. Modern forensic techniques might have solved the case decisively, but the evidence from the 1930s was either lost, destroyed, or degraded beyond useful analysis. The victims who were never identified took their secrets to unmarked graves, and their killer's identity died with the people who might have recognized him. Despite an investigation of the murders, which at one time was led by famed lawman Eliot Ness, the murderer was never apprehended. What remains clear is that the Cleveland torso murders represented a failure of the American criminal justice system at multiple levels. Police were unprepared to investigate serial killing, prosecutors were unwilling to pursue politically sensitive cases, and the social conditions that made vulnerable people easy targets were never addressed. The victims, at least 12 murders, most of which involved dismemberment and decapitation of the victims, were forgotten not just by their killer but by a society that viewed their lives as expendable. They died not just because a madman stalked Cleveland streets, but because they were invisible to the people who might have protected them. Today, Kingsbury Run has been transformed from Cleveland's shadow world into parks and development projects that show no trace of the horrors that occurred there in the 1930s. The shanty towns that Eliot Ness burned to the ground have been replaced by urban renewal projects designed to erase the memory of Cleveland's darkest chapter. But the legacy of the Mad Butcher extends far beyond the geography of his crimes. The Cleveland torso murders established patterns and revealed problems that continue to plague American law enforcement decades later. The case demonstrated how social prejudice could make certain victims invisible to investigators and the public. The focus on transients, prostitutes, and homeless people as expendable victims created a template that serial killers continue to exploit today. More troubling was the revelation that political connections could derail even the most serious criminal investigations. The inability to prosecute Dr. Francis Sweeney because of his family's political influence established a precedent that wealthy and connected suspects could escape justice regardless of the evidence against them. The case also exposed the limitations of celebrity law enforcement. Eliot Ness's reputation as an incorruptible crime fighter was built on carefully constructed mythology that collapsed when confronted with a case that required patience, subtlety, and political courage rather than dramatic raids and media-friendly operations. For the families of the victims, the few who were ever identified, the lack of resolution meant that their loved ones' deaths were never truly acknowledged or avenged. They died not just at the hands of a killer, but in the shadows of a society that had already forgotten they existed. The unidentified victims remain nameless to this day, their stories lost to time and indifference. They represent not just the failure to solve a particular case, but the broader failure of American society to protect its most vulnerable members from predators who understood exactly how disposable certain lives were considered to be. Dr. Francis Sweeney, if he was indeed the Mad Butcher, took his secrets to the grave, protected by mental illness, political connections, and a criminal justice system that was not equipped to handle the complexity of serial murder. His crimes went unpunished not because evidence was lacking, but because the social and political costs of prosecution were deemed too high. The Cleveland torso murders remain officially unsolved, a testament to the reality that some crimes are too complex, too political, and too disturbing for the justice system to handle effectively. They serve as a reminder that evil sometimes wins not through superior cunning or careful planning, but through the simple exploitation of social and political vulnerabilities that make justice impossible to achieve. In the end, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run succeeded not just in evading capture, but in exposing the fundamental weaknesses of American law enforcement and the society it was supposed to protect. His legacy is not just a body count, but a demonstration of how easily justice can be derailed by politics, prejudice, and the uncomfortable reality that some victims matter more than others in the eyes of those with the power to seek justice on their behalf.